and welcome. I'm Dave. Today we'll learn about TypeScript type assertion and typecasting. I'll provide links to example source code and all resources in the description below. I've also recently started a Discord server, and I've provided a link for you to join in the description below. It's a great place to post any questions you have about this video and to chat with other web development students too. Type assertion and typecasting are often used interchangeably on the web. Many resources choose just one term or the other and then stick with that as they reference the same concept. I searched on the web, and you can find sites like W3 Schools here that refer to this as TypeScript casting. Likewise, I searched the documentation, and while I'm not saying either one is right or wrong, as you will hear them and read about them used interchangeably on the web, the official documentation refers to this concept as type assertions. So that's what I'm going with today, but I put typecasting in the title as well because I know some refer to it that way, and you could possibly be searching Google or YouTube for typecasting just as easily as you could be searching for type assertions. So what are we referring to when we talk about type assertions? Well, it says right here, sometimes you will have information about the type of a value that TypeScript can't know about. And this comes into play when we work with the document object model, the DOM, so web page documents. And they give some examples of that here in the official docs. Another good description I read said something along the lines of assertion is simply telling the TypeScript compiler that you know more about the types, so it needs to listen to you because you have a little more detail than what TypeScript might infer or know about. And that, of course, becomes true when TypeScript doesn't know anything about the web page documents that you're working with. Our starter code today is the code from lesson 4, but we're not really going to use any of that, so I'm just going to select everything in this page and then press backspace to delete. Go ahead and save our main TS file where we'll look at some examples. And of course, we can start the compiler as well. And I do Control backtick to open a terminal window, type TSC and then -W for watch. Now, any TypeScript file we create in the source directory will be compiled to a JavaScript file that we have in the build directory. And we will create another file today, so that's coming up as well. But let's first start by just looking at some examples. And I'm going to create some aliases with the type keyword. So I'll put type, and then I'm just going to name this one and make the alias for a string type. And then type 2. And I'm going to assign that to a union of string and number types. And then type 3. And I'm going to set this equal to a literal type, so it can only have the one value of hello. Now that we have these 3 different types, let me go ahead and show one thing you can do with type assertion, and that is to convert to a more specific or less specific type than you start out with. So here I'll just say convert to more or less specific, just for a note in the source code. And we'll put let A, and we'll define this as the type 1. So that's going to be a string. And let's set it equal to a string of hello. So that is the string value, but it is still type string. When we hover over, we can see that that's what TypeScript knows. 1 is a string. After this, let's define B, and let's set B equal to A as 2. So what did I just do there? I assigned a type that was less specific because 2 is a string or number. And now we've put B equal to A, but A has the type of 2. Although it says A is a string here, we have changed the type to string or number. Now that is assignment to a less specific type. Likewise, we could say let C and set this equal to A as 3. Now that also works. We're being more specific here because A is equal to hello, and that is a literal here for type 3. It is the type hello, and we can do that because A was already equal to hello. So what we're doing there is assigning a type that is either less specific or more specific. And TypeScript does allow this with the as keyword. Now, besides the as keyword, we can also use angle brackets. And I'm sure you've seen examples with angle brackets if you have browsed any other TypeScript documentation. So here for the type 1, I could put it in angle brackets like this, and then I could give it an actual value. So D is going to have the value world, and it's a type string here that we dedicated with 1. Now I'm just going to copy this down with Shift Alt and the down arrow, and I'll change D to, say, the letter E, just the next one here. We don't have to have an alias here, so I could just put string in here, or I could put string or number as a union as well. Any of that works inside of these angle brackets also. You don't see me using the angle brackets that often, and that's because they cannot be used in TSX files that you would use in React, for example. So you cannot do this type of syntax that we see here with D and E in React. Okay, this is all fine, but you may be asking, when would I do something like this? Well, let's look at a more practical example where we can actually use assertions for narrowing. So I'll come down a couple of lines, scroll up here, and we'll start to define a function. And I'm going to call this function add or concat. So it can either add what we're going to give it, or it can concatenate, that is, combine what we're going to supply. So the first variable, the first parameter here, would be a number type. The second would be a number type. And the third is going to be a union of literals. So it could either specifically be the string add, or it could specifically be the string concat. After that, let's go ahead and say what type this function is going to return. It's going to return a number or a string, and I'm going to press Alt-Z to wrap this code down to the second line. And after that, we need to provide our arrow. Now, inside of the function, we're going to say if C equals the string add, get rid of that extra parentheses there. If C equals the string add, we're just going to return A plus B. And then otherwise, we're going to return an empty string plus A plus B, which that will coerce the numbers and make all of this a string that is returned instead. So the function can return number or string. That all looks good. But when we go to use the function, now an assertion can come in handy. So let's start out by saying let my val, and we expect this to be a string type. I'm going to set it equal to our function add or concat, and of course this will return a value. We'll just pass in 2 and 2, and then we'll pass in the string concat. And now, what do we expect this to return? Currently, TypeScript does not like this because add or concat is a number or string, so it's a union type there. But my val is just string, so the type string number is not assignable to just the type string. So we can fix this with an assertion. We're going to tell TypeScript that we know this is going to return a string because we told it to. And now TypeScript has no problem with my val being a string because we have told TypeScript explicitly through our assertion that add or concat will return a string in this instance. Now that said, remember, we're telling TypeScript that we know better than it does, essentially. When we do this, we are saying, hey, ignore the warning. We know we're returning a string. So let's look at another example here. I'm going to copy this down, and then I'll just rename a couple of things here. So instead of my val, I'll just call this next val, and it's going to be a number. So let's switch this to number. And now, of course, as a string won't work, but let's go ahead and put as number. You can see TypeScript has no problem with this, but we know there is a problem. So I'm just going to put in a note here, be careful, because TypeScript sees no problem here, but a string is returned. So just a note if you're going to download the source code or look at the examples, because this is something you can do with an assertion. You're telling TypeScript that you know better than it, but you're making a mistake. So mistakes can be made with assertions when you don't set them up correctly, because TypeScript is completely believing us now when we say add or concat is going to return a number. It's a possible value to return from the function, but we know when we pass in concat as an argument here that it is going to return a string like we showed above. Now TypeScript will still check assertions when it can. So I'm just going to take a value here like the number 10 and say as string. And you can see TypeScript does not like this. So let's mouse over and see what error we're going to get. I'll get rid of the IntelliSense. It says conversion of type number to string may be a mistake. So it checks you when it can, and that's a good thing as well. But just know that it can't always check like the example that I showed above. However, it gives us a hint here if we really wanted to do this. If we intentionally wanted to make 10 as a string, it says convert the expression to unknown first. And an unknown type is something we haven't covered. Unknown is a lot like any, except you can't use unknown anywhere unless you're doing something like we're about to do here. And this has also been referred to in some documentation or articles I've read as forced casting or double casting, because we're going to use two assertions. So when you know you want to cast something specifically, you're essentially going to overrule TypeScript. And here we could say 10 as unknown. So unknown is a special type, and we can do that. And then we can say as string. It's not going to complain about that, and we have basically done completed two assertions in a row. So 10 as unknown and then 10 as string. And that again is called double casting or forced casting, simply referred to as two assertions in the documentation. And that's what we're doing as well. So this, I'm telling you about this as a beginner. I don't recommend this at all because it overrules TypeScript, kind of like the AnyType. You want to avoid that whenever possible, but occasionally it is useful to know how to use it. Okay, let's scroll up for some more room, and now let's talk about where assertions I think can be very useful, and that is with the document object model, the DOM, or when we're working with web pages is another way to say that. And so let me define a variable called image. And as you might guess, we would select an image from our document. So I'll say document.querySelector. And now I'm going to tell this query selector to select an image. And that's good. But of course, TypeScript doesn't know what document we're linking our JavaScript to. It doesn't know anything about the document. So let's see what TypeScript knows about this when we say we're selecting an image with query selector. It can infer that it is an HTML image type, so that's fairly specific, but then it could also just be null. So that's kind of interesting. So what if we had a different thing in our query selector, a different value? Let's say we had an ID, and we'll just call it my ID here. Let's see what TypeScript infers now. It is just an element, so it doesn't know anything about an element if it's just selecting by ID, because that could be applied to any HTML element. So TypeScript was able to infer just a little bit more when we told it specifically what type of element. So let's go back, and I'll put that image element back in here, and it has inferred that it is an HTML image element. Now let me copy this down, and I'll call this next one my image just to compare. And let's use a get element by ID. And now let's just give this the ID of image, for example. So it doesn't really matter what the ID is. We're just going to look at what TypeScript infers now for my image. It says HTML element. So it doesn't know that it's an image element, but of course we're using get element by ID. So at least it knows it's an element instead of, or it's an HTML element instead of what we had through query selector there in the other example. So we've had element, HTML element, and we've also specifically had HTML image element. So those are all possibilities. And again, we're going from element that is very much less specific to HTML element, which is a little more specific, to HTML image element, which is even more specific. Now, before we use any type of assertion here, let's go ahead and try to access one of the properties of the image that we defined above. So image, we know it would have a source property. TypeScript does not like what it sees here. So let's mouse over and see what we get. It says object is possibly null, and you can see the image we have defined is possibly an HTML image element, but TypeScript acknowledges that that may not be in the document at all. So we need to go ahead and tell TypeScript we know better than it. We created the web page. We know there is an image element in the web page. So now let's say as, and then we can use some completion here. So we could say HTML. We could just say element, as we see that pop up here. But then we could also say HTML element, and that's an option. But TypeScript even inferred that it was an image element if it wasn't null. So we can get that all through the IntelliSense completion. That really helps us find what those different elements that we're selecting are. And now notice TypeScript has no problem with us accessing the source property. So what about our my image that we defined? And I want to go ahead and select the source property on it. So now we have a couple of problems. We have my image is likely an HTML element, but it could also be null. And then of course, you can't access the source property on the HTML element. It doesn't know specifically what type of element it is. So for example, a paragraph element wouldn't have a source property. So we need to be more specific once again. One thing we can do to convince TypeScript that, hey, we know this is there, we can use a non-null assertion. And that is simply putting an exclamation mark at the end here. So we can say, this isn't null. We know it's not null. So just using an exclamation mark is called a non-null assertion. But we still have a problem. So let's mouse over the source and let's see what it does. Property source does not exist on type HTML element. So now we also need to say that this would be as an HTML image element. Now, if you stop and think about it, we can remove this now, and you don't need to use that non-null assertion when you say exactly what it is here. That is an option. And if we stop and think, if we remove this, TypeScript was able to infer our first variable, HTML image element, up above here. So image, and it knew it was either an image element or null. So all we'd really need to do is put our non-null assertion at the end of the first one, and now it has selected the correct element type. But again, if we use as after and select the correct element type ourselves, that's also telling TypeScript that it is not null. So you do not need to use the non-null assertion in combination with an as and the type. And just as a reminder of that bracket syntax as well, I'll copy this down. I'm going to delete the as here, and let's just switch this to next image or something different, but we could use the angle bracket notation here at the beginning as well. So I could just say this is an HTML image element and do it by putting that here. So you could also see it this way, but once again, remember, this way will not work in TSX files for React. Okay, I'm going to scroll up just to comment out the error that we have in the TypeScript file here. I'll go ahead and save. But now also in the starter code for this lesson, if you download the source code in the build directory, I've added a couple of things to the index.html for this lesson. So we've got just a little bit more CSS here inside of the style element that's in the head. And then this is named copyright on our index.html. So I didn't create a second HTML file, I just modified the index. And we're linking to a copyright.js file. Notice inside of this copyright.js file, I've got a simple paragraph here in the body, and it just says copyright. It gives the copyright HTML entity here. And then we have a span element that has the ID of year. There is no information inside of the span element right now. So right now we would just see the word copyright and the copyright symbol from the HTML entity, and it would not give the year. We want to insert the year here with JavaScript. This is one of the most basic things that you see on almost every web page on the web is a copyright symbol, usually in the footer or somewhere on the home page. And so I think it would be good to look at an example of how we could do this same basic code with TypeScript. So I wanted to go ahead and highlight that this is in the index.html. So we're going to be selecting this span element, of course. And now let's create another TypeScript file, and it needs to be named copyright.ts. So we'll create this new file. And the way we have our compiler set up, it should have already now compiled a copyright.js file, and you can see the use strict at the top, so that's good. We're ready to put our TypeScript in here. So what I'm going to do first is just take the original JavaScript code that I've used on other websites. It's just 4 lines of code, but you can see TypeScript doesn't necessarily like what we're doing. So we're going to refactor this code to apply some of what we've learned about type assertion. So here we go. We're defining year first, and you can see year is an HTML element or possibly null. And then this year is a number, and that's because we're taking a date object and we're applying the getFullYear method to get whatever year that it currently is. And then you can see we have issues. So if we mouse over year, it says, well, year is possibly null, so that won't work. And if we mouse over this year, it said argument of type number is not assignable to a parameter of type string. So we want to assign this date time parameter and put the year in, and we can't do that because it's the wrong type. And then here, year is once again possibly null, and we're assigning text content, so it once again doesn't like that number type. So I think this is a great time to pause the video, go ahead and work up your solution for this, and then I'll come back with a couple of different solutions. All right, I'm back. I hope you did good. We're going to look at a couple of solutions. I'm going to copy all of this code first, and then I'll just put in here first variation, and I'll paste it all again below, and then I'll highlight this code above and just use Control/ and comment it all out. Let's go ahead and change this variation. And when you're first starting with TypeScript, I think it's easy to look at what TypeScript infers because it wants to help you. And from there, you can start to type out your code. So if we look right now, it says year is an HTML element or null. So let's go with that. I'll put the colon here and I'll say this is an HTML element or null. And now below, we can just set year equal to that selector. And I forgot to change const to a let when I'm going to use some double assignment like that. So now we have let year and HTML element or null, and then year is equal to our document.getElementById. So now we've explicitly assigned what TypeScript was previously inferring. Let's do the same with this year, and this time I'll remember to change const to the keyword let, and we'll say this year needs to be a string. Now remember, TypeScript inferred it was a number, but we knew what mistake we were getting, what note we were getting from TypeScript when it didn't like assigning a number to a place we needed a string later in our code. So now I've made this a string, and now we can say this year is equal to new date.getFullYear, but now it's still a number, right? That says number is not assignable to type string. So at the end of our chain here, we could just put the toString method, and now TypeScript is once again happy because this year is truly a string type. And now we've made all these changes and TypeScript still isn't happy with our set attribute. So when I mouse over, it says, hey, you forgot object is possibly null. We have no way of knowing that an HTML element is going to be selected. Maybe you'll try to select it and it doesn't exist. So we need to put in a type guard here, for example. So we could just say if year, and then we could put all of this inside. And I said type guard, but we're basically just checking to see if it exists or not. And that works. Now TypeScript is happy. But there's some things about this variation that I'm not necessarily happy with. But this is legitimate code. This is something you could easily do when you're first learning TypeScript. So let's go ahead and look at a second variation where we apply just a little bit more of what we've learned and we go ahead and use assertions. So I'm going to copy all of this down now with Shift, Alt, and the down arrow. And then after that, I'm going to comment out the first variation above, so Control and /. Now I'm just going to name this second variation. This will use some type assertions. And of course, we've learned we don't need to do this on 2 separate lines as I did here, but you might do that when you're first learning. Let's go ahead and switch this back to a const for year. I'll delete this second line, or at least I'll move part of it up to the other line. Now let's modify what we've got here. So we're going to say document.getElementById, and we've got the ID of year for our span element in the document. And now we want the equal sign, of course, since we're not just assigning a type there. And now after this, we can use an assertion. And I'm just going to say as HTML span element. So now we've explicitly told TypeScript, hey, we know that span element is in our document. We know it has the ID year, and that's exactly what we're selecting. So now when I mouse over, year is an HTML span element. So we've explicitly said that by using a type assertion. Now let's go ahead and switch the keyword let back to a const here also for this year, but we're not going to do the double assignment. We'll just bring this back up to the same line. So yes, we do want this year to be a string type, so we can say that, and we're going to set it equal to the date, get year, and still call that toString method, and TypeScript is good with that as well. And now after that, we don't really need our if statement at all, because we have told TypeScript with our assertion that yes, we're definitely going to have a year. It is not null. When we mouse over, you can see it says HTML span element, but it doesn't have the union type with the possible null value. So we can just go ahead and remove that if statement, and TypeScript is good with what we have left. And so that is the final variation, just a practical application of some of the things we've learned so far. Remember to keep striving for progress over perfection, and a little progress every day will go a very long way. Please give this video a like if it's helped you, and thank you for watching and subscribing. You're helping my channel grow. Have a great day, and let's write more code together very soon.